Hi everyone. You're odd people, taxes, on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. Here's what everyone else thinks of when they think about taxes. Here's what I want to do as quickly as possible, is just offer up a little bit of context to this whole tax conversation in British Columbia, where we're at right now. And then the second item there is, I think, what the folks at Columbia were most hoping I would share with you, which is last year we did some very deep opinion research with British Columbians about what they think about taxes, and to share some of that, highlights from that. And then to walk you through some options for raising new revenues. Now I'm going to focus primarily on provincial income taxes, but also some other options, and you'll see some overlap with some of the ideas that Taylor was talking about, and where perhaps a new provincial government could go in terms of figuring out new revenue arrangements with municipalities. And then I'll land somewhere very similar to Taylor, actually. So here's the context overall. We like to, at the CCPA, we like to talk about the two great inconvenient truths of our time: climate change and growing inequality. We're going to need, if we're actually going to tackle those, we're going to need more revenues together. And if we're actually going to tackle poverty reduction and adequately fund community care for seniors, and if we're adequately going to fund our education system, it's going to take new revenues. But here's the problem, which is a decade plus of tax cuts means that provincial taxes as a share of the economy, as a share of GDP, has declined since 2000 by 1.6%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's equivalent to $3.5 billion a year. Meaning if as a province we taxed at the same level that prevailed in the year 2000, the provincial treasury would have $3.5 billion more revenue. That's twice the size of the deficit at the height of the recession. Put another way, now we're all being bombarded with these ads talking about how we have the lowest taxes in the country, and we do. But here's what's annoying. We used to track the average, so the blue line there is BC. And we used to be average in the country in terms of the personal taxes, and we're including in this MSP premiums, because we're the only province in the country to charge MSP premiums. And then we saw really the Campbell tax cuts right out when they were first elected, and now we have the lowest in the country. And so we asked ourselves, well, how much more, instead of making a virtue of having such low taxes, how much more revenue would we have if we were just average? The provincial treasury would have $2.4 billion more to work with, not for having the highest taxes in the country, just for being average. I suspect the economic price of moving to average would be nothing, other than a lot of complaining. But it isn't just the drop in revenues, it's also this shift in where our revenues are coming from. And so the blue lines are the year 2000, the red are last year. And what you see is a huge drop-off in the one progressive tax we have, the income tax, where it's dropped by a third. The province now actually derives as much money from sales taxes as it does from income taxes. You'll notice a bit of a bump up in how much is coming from property taxes, which, as Taylor pointed out, is a regressive tax. You'll notice that the province now collects more in MSP premiums than it does in corporate income taxes. It's amazing, isn't it? And what does all of that roll into? So here our folks, Mark and Aglika, our economists, we have this StatsCan database with tens of thousands of tax filer data. We can really geek out on it, and model different stuff. So what we're looking at here is all taxes that individual households pay in BC. Income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, carbon taxes, MSP premiums, all rolled together. And then who pays what by income level. So we start with the poorest 10% of households, the next 10%, the next 10%, the next 10%. And then we break out the top 10%, so we even look at the top 1%. Now if we were just looking at income taxes, the line would be upward like this, because the income tax is progressive. But this, as I say, is all taxes rolled together. And when you do that, you get this, which, just to pause on it for a second, I know I'm a bit of a nerd, But that to me is a staggering line, which simply means this. In British Columbia, the more you make, the lower your overall tax rate. Welcome to the BC tax system. It didn't used to look like that, by the way. Back in 2000, it was basically kind of flat, and then it was a little progressive at the top 10%. But that's where we've landed. If you're in the top 1%, by the way, if these folks in the top 1% of households were simply taxed today at the same tax rate that they paid in 2000, on average, these households would be paying $41,000 more a year in taxes. So we've seen these shifts from where our revenues are coming from corporations to households, from upper income households to middle and modest income households, from progressive income taxes to regressive consumption taxes, MSP premiums, user fees, etc. But where do we go with all of that? What taxes should we increase? How do we talk to people about this? So here's where I want to share the opinion research that we did, and this was led by Shannon Daub, our communications director, and she teamed up with Randy Galawan, who's one of the Next Up alumni who's roaming around here helping out this weekend. And we did, we teamed up with Environics and did a very detailed online poll with over 1,000 British Columbians. And then Randy led focus groups, 9 focus groups in 3 cities, in Kamloops, Vancouver, and Nanaimo. And so we are now the repository of some very deep opinion research about what British Columbians think. So when we ask British Columbians, at what income level do you think people should be paying more taxes? Once you hit $100,000 a year, a clear majority think people should be paying more taxes. Which is why, with the Liberals, with their budget a few weeks ago, when they increased taxes at 150, it was kind of met with the collective yawn. I mean, everyone was like, okay. Major corporations, same thing. Very high support for increasing taxes on corporations. And interestingly, and this was true throughout, I kind of went into this polling thinking that taxes would be like a political wedge issue, particularly that separates Liberals and NDPers. Turns out not really. Liberal and conservative-minded voters, basically the same results. Now, if you just ask people in a poll, do you think you're taxed too much? Big surprise. People say yes. But here's what we were able to do in the online exercise. So, because it was on a computer screen with people, first of all, when you talk, people have a hard time conceiving of how much money are we talking about here when you talk about increasing their taxes. So right off the bat, on the screen that people saw, we tried to contextualize that and say, well, look, if you make $40,000 a year and you were to increase your overall taxes by 0.5%, that'd be $200 a year. If you made $80,000 a year, it'd be $400. If you increased it by 1%, well, it'd be $400, $800, etc., etc. Then, here's where we did something interesting. Because it was very easy, of course, in polling about taxes, for people to say someone else should pay more. The rich people, the corporations. But here, we were asking about themselves. And we had a very representative sample by income. And 11 different options came up in random order in a box here about different things that asked them, would you be willing to pay more yourself for these things? And overall, we got this. Most popular, almost 70%, said they would pay more in taxes to improve community health care for seniors. Very high support for action on BC forests. Look at this one, 53%. This isn't 53% saying they think welfare rates should be increased. It's 53% saying they themselves would be willing to pay more in taxes to make that so. Same deal for action on housing. And even things like tuition reduction and the $10 a day childcare plan that many people have been mobilizing on, these are what you might consider point of life things, right? You only need you benefit from these things at a particular period in your life, and yet almost half the people said, yeah, I'd be in for that. That's pretty good news, eh?
Yes.
Now, that made us wonder, though, were there like 30% of the people going, no, 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 no to everything? Turns out no. Actually, only 12% of people said no to everything. And almost 70% were willing to pay for 4 or more of those. 1 in 5 were willing to pay for all 11 of those options. And interestingly, by voter intention, that's the Green voter would say that, the NDP voter. But look at that, the Liberal, the Conservative voter, the mean was 5.8 of the 11 options. It's not a big wedge issue overall. And we tested along demographics, ethnicity, and income, and a whole bunch of things, and none of it was statistically significant except for this. The younger voter was 2 times more likely to say I'm in. Except on the seniors issue. But here's the interesting thing. I think within this is an interesting possibilities for intergenerational solidarity around tying things like the child care issue and the seniors care. But I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. In the focus groups, people are not simply like, sign me up, right? They have conditions on their support. And in particular, this level of mistrust and distrust of governments and politicians is toxic. And people, you talked about the efficiency piece. The problem is that people, their sense of waste and inefficiency is grossly inflated. Like in a focus group, you'll find people, they think if they just tackled waste and inefficiency, you would liberate 1/4 to 1/3 of the provincial budget, right? This is just not true. But, so we emerged with this really feeling like the problem is people think they pay taxes into this black hole. But when you put them through, we actually in the focus group put them through a little participatory budgeting exercise. Now the participatory budgeting exercise wasn't very informative. What was interesting is how different the tax conversation was afterwards. Because now in people's minds, they were circling back to what it was actually paying for. So in terms of key lessons out of the opinion research, one is this notion of everybody pitching in a little. Just the price of a cup of coffee a day, really, for a lot of people. But that it also has to be everyone paying their fair share. So those who are wealthy or corporations should pay a bit more. The transparency piece was key. People want to know what it's being paid, what the money's going towards. And this whole idea of connecting it back to quality of life for all generations. And participation is the game changer in those focus groups. That when people are invited to deliberate on this stuff together, the whole conversation changes. So those are lessons that I think translate municipally as well. But now I want to walk you through some options for raising revenues. And start with the income tax. Now just for starters, a little reminder, we have 5 income tax brackets in British Columbia. The top one kicks in at about $100,000 a year. We saw big tax cuts under the provincial Liberals from between 2001 and 2002. So that top marginal tax rate, federal provincial combined, is now the 4th lowest in the country. And if you want to know who's paying all of this, interestingly, almost 60% of British Columbians their incomes are below $37,000 a year. They're just in the first tax bracket. That's the only one they pay. Next group pays into the second bracket, and only about 5.5% of British Columbians make over $100,000 a year. So here's the first scenario now. First scenario, what if we took that top tax bracket and moved it to 17%? I'm just going to show you how much money different things raise, and I'm just going to throw out a bunch of options. I'm not saying this is what you should do. I'm just giving you a taste of what it could pay for. That would raise $375 million a year. That would be enough to increase welfare rates by between $200 to $400 per month. If we brought in a new tax bracket at 150 at 18%, only the top 2% of British Columbians would be impacted. That would raise $400 million. That's how much you need to build 2,000 new units of social housing a year. If you brought in another tax bracket at $200,000 a year, 200. Now you got the top 1%, that occupies. Now you've raised 700 million. Now guess what? Now you have enough to restore class sizes, composition, and specialist teacher levels to where they were 5 years ago. All right, here's another scenario. What if we also did the 2 brackets and we increased the top bracket to 17%? Now you'd raise 930 million. Now you could do everything I just mentioned, and you could increase post-secondary funding by 10%, which just got cut in the last budget. Here's another scenario. Top 2 brackets, but now let's be even a bit more bold. Let's increase all 3 of the top of the current 5 brackets. Only 14% of British Columbians would be affected. Now you've broken the $1 billion mark. Now you could do everything I just mentioned and bring in the first phase of the $10 a day childcare plan. And the Grand Slam option. All right. Now, I just want to point out a little. I'm going to do a little quiz with you. Okay. Look how crazy I am. 20% increase in all tax brackets. People are like, what is he thinking? Right? Now, I showed you in a graph earlier that most British Columbians only pay the first tax bracket, which was 5%. What's 20% of 5%? 1%. Do you feel the same way about it? Did you follow the math?
Yes.
The vast majority of British Columbians, the bottom 90% or so of British Columbians after deductions, are paying a provincial income tax rate of less than 5% of their income. I make 3 times the median income. I pay 4%. 20% of 5% is 1%. For most British Columbians, a 20% increase in all tax brackets amounts to between $200 and $800 a year. The price of a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons, not Starbucks. And it raises $2.3 billion. And now you could do the welfare and the social housing and the class size and composition and the first phase of childcare and community health care and MCFD and the post-secondary and the environmental protection. All right, that's individual side. Here's a whole other thing. Carbon tax, where to go with it. So, right now the carbon tax, there's no more scheduled increases. It's tapped out at $30 a ton. If we continued with $5 annual increases in it, after 4 years, we would raise $2.2 billion. If we broke with revenue neutrality, which is what Taylor was talking about, you could take half of this and put it towards an expanded credit. And Mark Lee in our office has modeled how to do this in a way where the bottom half of households would be net beneficiaries. They would get more in the credit than they pay in the tax. You could also have some money for regional equality elements of it. And the other half, to get the job done on climate by transferring it to the municipalities to take action on building retrofits and transit and that kind of thing. These are just a few of the options. There are many others. There's closing loopholes and deductions. This is actually one area where we saw a tiny bit of action from the federal government this week, but there's much more that could be done. I could say more about the RSP, which is the one that annoys me the most, but I'll save it for discussion. The property tax. So the property tax, as Taylor mentioned, is regressive. There are possibilities to make it more progressive. John Kesselman, who's a tax economist at SFU, has modeled, for example, over certain thresholds, adding 0.5%. And after another threshold, again, it's true that it's regressive, but here's the problem. In a society like ours where we have no wealth tax or inheritance tax, this is really our only kick at the can. We also give the homeowner's grant to everybody, regardless of ability to pay or income, and it costs the province $750 million a year. The homeowner's grant. Maybe it should be income tested. Then there's the corporate taxes. each 1% increase, you get about 200. And then also what Taylor was talking about, resource royalties. This is a huge area where we're not getting nearly what we should. We've got boatloads of trees leaving the province at $25 cents per telephone pole, and it's been stuck at that rate for decades. We've got water that's going for nothing, and on natural gas, as you know, when you watch the finance minister talk about the squeeze in revenues, and he's talking about declining natural gas revenues, but natural gas production is at an all-time high. How is that? Because the royalty regime is based on a formula that's tied to price, not volume. We are producing more than ever and getting nothing for it. A finite greenhouse gas. We're giving it away for a song right now. So, I'd love to see a new government just do a full resource royalty review. Put the whole thing on there and figure out what makes sense and who should get how much. Luxury taxes, vehicle taxes, regulating and taxing cannabis, it's all possible. Last slide. I would end right where Taylor did, actually. Basically I have the same last slide as you. We've convened this whole tax project at the CCPA. Keith's a part of it. And there's specific things that we think should be on the table right now in the way of increases, and we'd love to see the political parties run with. But bigger than that, what we really need, and I think British Columbians deserve, and you could get a taste of what could come out of it in the opinion research, is a big conversation. Something big and deliberative, some big engagement thing like the conversation on health that we had a few years ago, on taxes, or on revenues more broadly, and framed ultimately in exactly the way Taylor said. What are the things that we want to pay for together, and how do we want to raise the money? Put the whole thing on the table. From a starting place of knowing that downward sloping line. And we have two things we need to fix. We need to restore fairness, and we need to raise more revenue if we're actually going to get some key pieces of work done together. And I'll stop there.
Wow.